Welcome to CharityVillage Connects. It's been quite a start to 2025. We've got a new, or rather a returning president in the US who's threatening ruinous tariffs on all Canadian goods sold into America. And we're about to get a new prime minister in Canada with Justin Trudeau's resignation. The bureaucracy in Ottawa is essentially frozen with the prorogation announcement, and even the new Liberal prime minister, whoever that might be, is likely to have an abbreviated tenure, with opposition parties threatening a non-confidence vote as soon as Parliament returns, triggering a federal election. On top of that, we've had 3 provincial elections in 2024 and are scheduled to have 2 more provincial and 2 territorial elections in 2025. That's a lot of political and economic upheaval. All Canadians, but especially nonprofits, will have to adapt to the ever-shifting political landscape and impacts on our economy and our society. In our last episode, we talked to experts about how to navigate the enormous changes. Now we want to hear from Canadian charities and nonprofits. We want to understand what they're experiencing on the ground and drill down on their deepest concerns and their strategies on how to navigate this ever-shifting landscape to survive and thrive into the future. To help us understand some of the challenges and anticipated trends, please welcome Carolyn Stewart, CEO of Feed Ontario, the province's largest collective of hunger relief organizations. Together with food banks, industry partners, and local communities, Feed Ontario works to end hunger and poverty by delivering fresh and healthy food, developing innovative programming, and driving change through research and advocacy. Welcome to the podcast, Carolyn.
Thanks so much for having me.
Well, let's start by getting a picture of what's happening with food banks on the ground right now. What's the situation like in Ontario? Can you give us some background on how many food banks are operating in Ontario and how many people in Ontario are accessing their services?
Yes, most definitely. So our network in the province is made up, we service 145 direct member food banks who support over 1,100 agencies. So an agency is anything from a community kitchen, a shelter, a meal program, really anything that provides emergency food support to someone in need. And to give you a picture of what it's looking like, in short, it's not good. It is getting exponentially worse every single year. We have seen eight consecutive years of growth in demand at food banks, with need now surpassing 1 million people accessing our services over 7.6 million times in the last year. This is the highest number on record that we've ever been recording data, which we've been doing for quite some time. And realistically, what's most importantly is that our network was really never built to withstand this level of demand, right? I think sometimes people forget that food banks are meant as an emergency measure, right? We are meant as a temporary mechanism to help people get by. We're definitely not a solution. And so what we're seeing is the response to this growing demand, exponential demand, really weighing on the food bank network, with 40% of our network reporting they've had to either reduce the amount of food that they're providing just to make sure that they're able to meet demand, but also potentially even change types of services or reduce wraparound supports because they provide additional services beyond emergency food support. So unfortunately, things are not good. And with the great summary you provided, the amount of change and upheaval that's happening in the country does not give us hope that things are going to get better anytime soon.
Wow, that is a bleak picture and really, really concerning. Now, as you mentioned, and as we discussed off the top, across Canada, we've seen really unprecedented political change with numerous provincial elections, as well as political upheaval in the federal government. We're on the brink of an election in Ontario. What impact are you seeing on your member food banks in terms of political uncertainty? Dealing with the potential for different governments with different priorities or different spending levels.
Yeah, most definitely. I think uncertainty is the name of the game when it comes to elections, realistically. But I think we always try to be pragmatic. Maybe is a good word. In that there's a lot of opportunity too, right? With change comes opportunity. And so, similar to other organizations, we are worried about the cost of living, how it's impacting community, people, the organizations that we're servicing. And then on top of that, obviously, consistent concern over the last few years has been the affordability and availability of housing. We're seeing rising homelessness in communities across the country. Um, and then on top of that, essential and valued social services programs that are providing those key supports in communities are being increasingly relied on to provide all the services. So everything a community needs is shifting really to nonprofits. So going back what I said earlier, food banks are not a solution to food insecurity. We're a temporary measure to help address it in the temporary meantime. And so that's really why Food Ontario and our network of food banks advocate at all levels of government for policy changes and social support investments that really go to those root causes, because ultimately that's where we're going to see change. And so as we get ready for the provincial election, our network is calling on all parties to really prioritize people and take bold action on poverty by investing in people and communities, because that's what we need to see. Whether it be affordable housing and tenant protections, quality employment and worker protections, and even really reinvesting in those social support programs that we've seen disinvestments in over the last 2 decades. And then on top of that, particularly for those living with disabilities and who have experienced job loss, which is a very real threat right now with the potential for tariffs. All of those things are important to keep in mind when starting to plan for the future. And then I think overall, we are looking for civic engagement. I think it's no matter how you vote, it's important to vote. We want to make sure that everyone at all levels of the community are engaged in making a say as to what kind of change they want to see here in Ontario.
We want to explore the tariffs and some of the influences of the new government south of the border. But first, I wanted to sort of understand the situation with food banks generally in Ontario, at least. Are the organizations that you serve generally government funded? And if so, is there a concern that changes in government may impact this funding? Is there any way organizations can work to mitigate the impact of a potential decrease in funding should it actually happen?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's a common actually misconception about food banks. We receive no government funding unless it's specifically program related. So, we work in partnership with the government on emergency response. So in when we provide specific supports, but otherwise we don't. So that's the case for most food banks. Some receive a small amount of municipal funding, but that would be the exception. But mostly they're exclusively funded by either corporate funders and partners or private individual donors. And so we don't have significant concerns about government funding for us, but it's a definite huge concern within the broader nonprofit sector, as many in the areas of mental health and addictions, other social services and wraparound supports, housing are supported by government funding. But overall, even without being government funded, we are still seeing a significant decline in funding and support. And that's just because people are having a harder time getting by every single day, right? So we're needing more to run our operations because we're seeing such increased demand. And then on the other side of that, we're seeing fewer donations come in the door. So we're seeing a decline in monthly donors, people having to cancel their donations because they just can't make those ends meet every single month. We're seeing fewer amounts of food donations at food banks as well. And we're even hearing stories of people who were once donors to the food bank now visiting the food bank for support. So it's definitely drastically different than what we've seen. And so for us, what we're working on to address that is to work differently, right? What we're seeing is the old ways of how we do something is no longer working. So we're trying to find more collaborative approaches to our work, whether that be collaborative leveraging of resources, finding ways to be more efficient. We launched a new project called Feed Collaboration around food procurement to do it more effectively, which has been very successful. So overall, that's what we're really focusing on. But either way, we know it's essential for the province to invest in the sustainability of the nonprofit sector, and really to ensure that they can continue doing the work that they are doing, because it is essential. All of the key supports that they provide, they're the fabric of their communities, and we need to make sure that they continue to be there for the most vulnerable.
That's very interesting, and I think that certainly would be surprising to a lot of Canadians to understand that you weren't directly government funded, except for those emergency programs that you partner with the government with on. Um, but you did mention in your government relations and advocacy work that you are supporting other organizations that are meant to provide the other services around, safe housing and drug addiction, etc. And that because that's part of the system or the very communities that you are having come to your organization, or your member organizations for the services that they offer. Is that something that, did I understand you correctly in that? And is that something that you're seeing your members actively engaged in?
In terms of advocacy work?
Yes, government
Yeah.
relations and advocacy.
Yeah, so actually one of our pillars is feed change, and really that centers around advocacy and research around the issues of food insecurity and what's really driving people to access food banks. Because ultimately, as we're not the solution, we feel we have a very direct role in playing to make recommendations on how to make change happen, so our services are no longer needed. So our advocacy work as an organization and as a network is year round. Apologies, and includes regular meetings with MPPs, stakeholders. We do lobbying days at Queen's Park. We participate in roundtable discussions, consultations, that sort of thing, to make sure that we're continuously sharing these stories and these recommendations on how we know we can make change. With the upcoming election, Feed Ontario is also working to inform voters on how each party is planning to prioritize poverty and what we would like to see prioritized. So again, it's all about information and making sure that people are balanced and understand what they're voting for when it comes to election time. I think I mentioned briefly we really want the provincial government, to take bold action on poverty and not just invest in businesses, which is also very important. But we need to find a balance to make sure that we're investing in people and communities as well. And so while our network itself are stretched very thin, from our lens, we always create tools and resources so that we can collectively engage in advocacy work on the ground level as well.
Well, do you have any tips or strategies that you can share for other organizations who may be starting to do government relations work or advocacy, perhaps for the first time, due to the demands on their services and their concern about lack of funding and the economy in general? It'd be great to sort of hear any tips that you might have. And I know that you have these resources, but maybe you could provide something for our listeners to understand.
Yeah, most definitely. I think definitely advocacy and government relations work can sometimes seem overwhelming and a bit intimidating if you've never done it before. But I think first and foremost, like, always remember that you're the subject matter expert. Your area of expertise probably better than the person in the room, and so that you're going to see. So you need to make sure that you're the subject matter expert. You know what you're talking about, but present that information in a digestible way. So MPPs, as I mentioned, come from diverse backgrounds, right? Like, they're not going to have the same depth of knowledge of you, or even just work. You work day to day in those issues, so it's not going to come straightforward to them. But if they can understand your issues in a a digestible way. Taking something complex and making it tangible is definitely an essential first step and something we try very, very hard. And second, I think it's always important to find common ground, which can be very difficult. But we ultimately believe that people who get into politics are there because they want to make a difference in their community. They're passionate about something, and that's why they're there. And so we may not always agree on what that looks like or how to get there, but we may have a shared priority. So finding ways to really work together on those shared priorities can really go a long way at building those relationships and those foundations for future change as well. And I think finally and most important, I think it's essential to be honest. The challenge we face as a province are complex, and sometimes governments don't really have a clear line of sight on how different policies or interventions are actually affecting the individual and people. So you are there as a voice of the people and as a voice from the community or group that may not otherwise have a voice. And so you need to speak clearly and honestly about the realities that people are facing and families are facing, and how the government policies or practices are impacting their lives, whether that be good or bad. So change you may have seen by a great policy implementation, or alternately one that's creating barriers and challenges for many families within your community. So, for us, we always say we think there's always opportunity, and we're never going to be able to move forward as communities unless we have informed dialogue and we're willing to collaborate.
Well, that's very, very helpful. I'm sure it'll be appreciated to the listeners of the podcast and the folks that watch this video. Of course, the US election has already impacted Canada as well, both economically and socially, at least in terms of, in the short term, with the threatened tariffs and now a potential reprieve that we don't know how long it will last, whether or not we will ultimately get the kind of tariffs that we've talked. Is this something that your organization or your member organizations are concerned about? I wonder what your thoughts are around that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a very concerning time for a lot of people and communities. We're seeing changes to social policies, people's rights, and even decisions that can drastically impact our economy. And so when it comes to our network, and particularly given how overstretched they already are, as I said, we're seeing the highest demand ever on record. But the concern of the action south of the border and what that could result in terms of job losses for so many Ontarians and Canadians, what that will mean for businesses, what that may mean for businesses who are partners but may no longer have funding to support organizations or partner on key initiatives that are helping ensure that we can provide our services. And so, it's so many unknowns right now, which is what the biggest concerns for us are. And right, we're already seeing governments, as we've seen, take action, make promises regarding emergency relief for business, but we haven't necessarily seen the government's response on what the emergency response will be for people and for families. And so, again, we need to make sure we're taking a broad lens and approaching policy and responses to situations, looking at the complexity, because it's not just one to one, right? We know that something as simple as complex, sorry, not simple, complex as poverty, is so many different things intertwine and contribute to how someone gets there, but also what leads them to barriers to even getting out of poverty. And so with what we're seeing and the drastic impacts that we can see on our economy if these tariffs are put into place, are, I think, huge cause for concern for everybody. And I will say we are glad to at least see the pause button and calmer heads prevail while discussions can happen.
Yes, we don't know how long that pause will last, and whether the threats will come back or be imposed, and what Trump may demand for another pause. I, I wonder, what can organizations do to prepare for this possibility? What's your your organization as an umbrella organization preparing for this possibility? Is there any steps that can be taken now to sort of bolster their resilience should this happen?
Yeah, I mean, for us, when we look at our data and how we've seen the longstanding affordability crisis impact Ontarians. We know that there are just so many families who are one paycheck away from needing a food bank, one paycheck away from potentially losing a roof over their head. And so, whether today or in the future, we need all levels of government to prioritize the investments and help ensure that should there be a sudden or significant job loss, that people are able to stay on their feet or get back on their feet. And so, from our lens right now, the food bank network does not have the capacity to shoulder another significant economic downturn. So, we're still serving the influx of demand that actually got brought on by the pandemic. So it's never slowed down since then. And so when we put the affordability crisis on top of that, it's really just made something so complex. And what the scariest part, I think, is for everyone is, when we saw the 2008 recession, our food bank use didn't actually peak after that till 2 years later, because oftentimes people are using all the other mechanisms to get by before having to go to a food bank. So, burning through savings, borrowing from payday loans or friends, staying on people's couches, that sort of thing before they have to do that. But now the precarity is so much higher, because we're post pandemic and post affordability crisis. We don't think it's going to be delayed like that to allow time to prepare. It is going to be a tsunami of demand. And so realistically, again, our focus would most likely be on advocacy and government relations, to make sure that, as I said, that the message is clear, that the voice of those that we're servicing are being heard, that it's not solely businesses being prioritized, but also, in terms of emergency response, making sure that communities and people and individual families have the capacity to respond, because ultimately, families being able to weather that storm on their own without social services is the ultimate best solution prior to relying on us.
So there may be, if the worst happens, the possibility that you will have to partner with government again for emergency relief, I assume.
Yeah, so we do. So during the pandemic, we did work with them, to execute emergency response to ensure that food banks and communities had access to emergency food. So we built food bank campers, about 400,000 of them in 12 weeks, just to make sure that's served. Continuing on after that, we work now, but that's more an emergency response in the case of flooding, fire season, with the recent snow that we had, in Northern Ontario and like Gravenhurst area. We worked with other nonprofits to make sure that food was able to get to people who were snowed in or isolated. So that's the kind of emergency response that we do right now. But we do speak with the government frequently, and so I think they know who we are, they know what we do, and so that's what I would also encourage any nonprofit or charity is to make sure to reach out to your local representative, make sure they know who you are, what services you provide, and the essential work you do, because we all know nonprofits are incredible and do such great work for the community. So making sure you stay in touch with your government representatives is key, particularly during times of emergency.
Well, I'd like to shift gears for a moment and talk a little bit about Canada's changing demographics. We know that food banks, as you've very eloquently described, are reporting higher usage generally, with more users who are employed and more newcomers to Canada relying on food banks. The percentage of seniors accessing food banks is rising, and there's also been reports of increasing student demand, including, as reported by Greater Vancouver Food Bank, increasing numbers of international students accessing the services. Are shifting population demographics and population growth impacting the demand for service that food banks are seeing?
Yeah, ultimately, we've always reflected key demographics and key growth demographics that we've seen. For us, what we've seen in terms of the shifting demographics is really how hard it's becoming for everyone. Because unfortunately, there's not one demographic that has necessarily escaped being food insecure and accessing a food banks or support. So I briefly mentioned this before, but we know that people only access food banks after they've exhausted all other options. So downsizing their home, selling, a car, borrowing from friends, taking out loans, that sort of thing. And so we're really a last resort. And so now that we've seen the decrease in access to affordable and appropriate housing for people, on top of the rise in precarious work. So the type of works and the proper supports that are coming, whether that be through wages and benefits, and even something as simple as a paid sick day, are really impacting the demographics of who we're seeing and why we're seeing them. And the longer that these types of problems persist, is the more likely we'll see a more diverse group of folks. It's funny that people were quite surprised to see students accessing food banks, because we've actually had a food bank on every university and college campus in the province for many years. When we have to think about it, it's people with a limited income who are accessing food bricks, right? So are working on a very small, limited income. And when prices and costs of things grow exponentially, their income doesn't grow with that. So they're having to stretch an already stretched dollar even further. And so students is just another one of those groups. And so what I can say is the increase in demand itself is not because of the increase in population total that we're seeing, but rather it's because of the policies and supports that are needed so that everyone can we can ensure everyone can afford basic housing, earn a livable wage, and really access all of their basic necessities. And those things aren't there.
I wonder, given the picture you've painted and the enormous demand on the food banks that are in existence, particularly post-pandemic and now even continuing today, can food banks continue as they traditionally have, not relying on government funding, given both the population growth and in certain areas of the country, along with the current demographic changes, along with you know obviously issues of our economic health and well-being financially as Canadians. Is radical change in the system needed to better support Canadians? Should the government be supporting food banks and other related services?
Yeah, I mean, we were never intended to be there this long. When we opened in the 80s, it was again a stopgap measure in response to a recession, right? I think food charity in the broadest sense has always existed, right? Whether that be through local religious institutions or community support groups, but really it was like formalized at that time. But what we've seen and why we've become more entrenched in the social safety net is because we've become progressively relied upon during economic downturns or to fill the holes left by bad public policies. It's not surprising that our growth in need mirrors the lack of affordable housing being built in the last 40 years, the disinvestments that we've seen in our social support programs over the last several decades. All these things are coming to a head at once, right? So when you don't take care of something, it starts to fall apart. And so what we're seeing is the result of decades of underinvestment in social programs. And so they're increasingly relying upon nonprofits or charity organizations to fill those holes. And so Feed Ontario doesn't want food banks to continue as they traditionally have. In fact, we'd love to become unnecessary and extinct. It would be wonderful. But I do think radical system change is needed for us to get there. We need to see poverty as a key priority across the board. because they don't understand that an investment dollar proactively can reduce costs. Even if we're looking at it not in a social argument, but rather an economic argument, investing upfront proactively to avoid that is such a return on investment when it comes to success of people and communities in our province. And so we really just think people really do, I think the opportunity is there. This is a time for change. And so we're trying to stay hopeful that people are willing to grab that change and be bold in the choices and the action that they take. And as we're saying, prioritize people and make sure that poverty reduction is something that they're looking to do and hopefully put us out of a job.
I'd like to know whether the population growth and the demographic changes that we've talked about also provide opportunities as challenges for food banks, not just challenges, but opportunities as well. For example, in terms of a larger potential donor pool and being able to better recruit staff and volunteers, what is your thought about that? If we have seen this we saw such dramatic population growth just in the most recent years, post pandemic, is this also a way of actually being able to, I guess, make a bigger tent and bring more people in to support the causes and the missions that we're pursuing?
I think there's a lot of things to consider in that, because when what we see is that you know all of these pieces need to grow together, right? So when we see communities almost need to be developed in a way that meets the needs of the people who live there and then scaled accordingly, right? And so when we're seeing population growth, it hasn't been coupled with the growth in purpose-built housing or the right types of jobs for people. We're seeing shifts in the sector. We're seeing different skill sets and different needs for jobs, and so those two things aren't matching up as well. And then on top of that, like even better support scaled accordingly as people navigate challenges. So even something as simple as services are now offered online, or you have to navigate it online, but 30% of food bank clients don't have access to the internet. And so there's almost these complex challenges that aren't fitting together or dovetailing the way they're supposed to. And so when those things don't grow alongside the population growth, so the supports and the needs of the communities, whether it's, population growth or any other factor, it becomes increasingly difficult for families and people of the community to navigate how to get there and get the supports they need, or alternately even find solutions so that they're not falling into poverty. And so we believe poverty is a policy choice, and good public policies need to be prioritized to make sure that all communities, no matter their size, their population, who they represent, really support the health and well-being of everyone who calls that place home. And so I think there's tons of opportunities for even increased engagement, efficiency, and collaborative work. And so we encourage not only nonprofits, but the government and community to work more effectively together to try and get there.
Well, as we wrap up our discussion today, I wanted to ask you if you have any final words of advice to nonprofits and charities that might be listening on how to navigate these very difficult and challenging and uncertain times.
Yeah, I think take a breath. Remember that the work that you do is vitally important. Remember to share the stories of the people you serve, because you are making such an incredible difference in their lives every single day. And also just get out there and vote. To be quite honest, your strongest tool and those in the community is your voice. So make sure to encourage everyone in your community to participate in the democratic process. I think the 2022 election had the lowest voter turnout ever on record. So if we can encourage people to share what they want to see in their communities. I think that that's the first step in getting there, and to remain hopeful, because change is possible if we all want it to be there.
Well, Carolyn, it's so great to speak to you and learn so much about the really important work that you're doing, and to help listeners and myself understand the challenges that are facing Canadian nonprofits on the ground and in the community. It's so valuable in providing actionable advice to our audience of nonprofit professionals. Thank you for the great work that you do and for joining us on Charity Village Connects.
Thanks so much for having me.